Hey, everybody, it's Matt Hines. We are back with another Hines on Air. And the guest we had today is very impressive, super educated, super experienced. She's done a lot. And rather than me try to memorize this resume, which is impressive, let me just read some of these. All right, she's got a Bachelor's of Science in Economics. She's got a Master's in Business Administration from Rutgers University, and also a Master's of Science in Marriage and Therapy. So she's worked with many different types of people with many different problems. She's helped them with anxiety, depression, eating disorders, trauma, premarital advice. So she's done her marriage advice. So she's done it all. So welcome to the show, Julie. How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing well. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, totally. So give us, just in a nutshell, kind of describe what a day in the life is for you when you're working with clients and, the different types of issues you're encountering.
Yeah, so I am, primarily focused on working with couples. So I do a lot of relational work as a marriage and family therapist. And I'm also trained specifically in something called EMDR. I don't know if you're familiar. EMDR it's an acronym for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. I know it's a lot, but essentially it's a modality of working with trauma. So I do a lot of trauma work with clients on a day-to-day in addition to couples work.
Can you break that down? Like, what does the eye movement have to do? If somebody's traumatized, they have different sort of eye reactions, or what is that?
No, so what we really try to do with clients is we walk them through their particular traumatic experience, memory. We call it like a float back memory. And we use something called eye movement desensitization. So it's like, I don't know if people can see me, but you can track people's eye movement with a pen while they talk through their trauma. Or we use a tapping methodology so they can tap. It has to be bilateral. So whether they're engaging their eyes bilaterally or they're tapping somewhere on their body physically bilaterally, it's a way essentially to engage the body somatically while they're talking through their trauma as a way to reprocess it so that it's not so activating.
So it balances out sort of the mental and physical aspect of it. Like, tell me about re-engaging the body. I don't break that down for me.
Well, I think what happens with trauma is often when we experience some kind of trauma, it can impact how we move through certain places in our life or some relationships, or we can find ourselves stuck in different ways. So, for example, if I experience a trauma with regard to, let's say, a car accident, maybe I don't want to drive, in a certain place, or maybe I just don't want to drive anymore, right? And so what happens with trauma is because that particular memory can keep us stuck somehow.
That's right.
Right. And so the intention of EMDR is to help us move that trauma from that place of stuckness. We call it like keep it stuck in the amygdala, which is like the fight or fight place in our brain, to a place that's more like cognitively enhanced, right? The frontal cortex, the place in us that recognizes that we have capacity for reasoning, for understanding, for language processing, right? And so we have to engage the body, at least as that's what the research tells us, is that we have to engage the body as a way to bridge moving that memory from that place of stuckness in the amygdala to the frontal cortex.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting. And there's a lot of research to back it up. It's more of, it's not necessarily like a mainstream modality, but it's definitely, I think, becoming more popularized in therapeutic spaces.
Okay, that's cool. I'm very familiar with the concept of trauma and stuff. But I don't know if you've seen any of my earlier stuff. I've worked with Dianetics for a long time, which is a mental therapy, so much brain-based, but it's certainly experiences and recordings of the past affecting a person now, how to get rid of those so they're not holding the person back. So it's a good area. It needs more search. And are you into therapy and drugs, or not therapy, but drugs, or is it mainly the procedures and stuff you're talking about?
I don't prescribe. I am entirely supportive of like medication as a way to help people get unstuck. I would always say that if you're engaging medication, for the most part, like navigating it with talk therapy is, I think, always the way forward.
Navigating it how?
With talk therapy.
Talk therapy. Okay, good. Yeah.
Yes,
I agree. I would encourage people to try the talk therapy before the drugs.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. Yeah, sure.
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, this is a completely random question. Have you ever heard of nystagmus?
No.
The eye, it's the movement of the eye as you're trying to follow something to the right or to the left, and as the object gets farther, the eye will start to like sort of jerk. And that's part of nystagmus. This is completely random, so I apologize.
No, not at all.
Okay, so we do criminal defense in our law firm, and one of the tests that they do to people to see if they're under the influence of alcohol is called the nystagmus test. And the cops will ask them to step out the car, and they'll ask them to follow a little light, and they drag it to the left and drag it all the way to the right. You're supposed to follow with your eye, not with your head. And if the eye starts jerking, called nystagmus, it's an indication. It's anyway. It's right.
Well, it's probably to some extent kind of how the founder of EMDR maybe got sort of like an awareness as far as kind of how eye movement tracking, how that actually sort of taps into what's coming up for us internally.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. It's fascinating work.
One of the things about it is that's one of the tests. Other tests that they do, they call it the heel to toe, where you walk and toe, or the one-legged stand. But nystagmus is not controllable by the individual. It is sort of an automatic reaction that you can sort of concentrate and walk better, but you can't concentrate and stop the nystagmus anyway.
That's what it is, right? I mean, I think when you talk about trauma, right?
That's right.
Trauma response is very often autonomic, right? It's just very, it's not something that we can control.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, cool. All right. So also, I read in your biography that you, not biography, but just your write-up about your profession and all. You work with people on marriage counseling. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Give me an example of one of the most relevant or followed topics that we've done on our podcast are relationships. Everybody, it's tough. I mean, it's hard. Relationships are great. They're the greatest thing, but when they're bad, they're the worst thing. And a lot of people go through these ups and downs. And a lot of people end up in divorce and stuff. So what kind of advice, what have you found through your years of working with couples?
So I'm trained, Matt, in a modality called emotion-focused therapy. And so emotion-focused therapy, if I could share it just briefly, emotion-focused therapy is really, it is essentially like a way of looking at our experience with other people, right? Our relational experience from kind of like almost like a framework of a hierarchy, right? So it starts with our understanding of our triggers. There are certain things that come up for us that are outside of our body, right? That can activate for us like a threat response, right? Something that happens outside of us that tells us that we are under some kind of threat. It can be a real threat. It can be a perception of threat. The nervous system does not necessarily reactively make that distinction. Okay. When we experience that threat, our body goes into a threat response behavior. So often when couples are in relational conflict, the only thing that they see between each other is their threat response behavior, right? So one person in the couple might be what we describe in EFT as the withdrawer, as in like when there is a conflict, I pull back, I duck and cover, right? I am hiding, right? Then there's another person often in the couple that's what we describe as the pursuer. The pursuer is the person who wants to fight for everything. I would say they both get triggered, but they operate very differently, right? The withdrawer gets triggered, but they shut down and they're avoiding in the withdrawing. And then the pursuer is getting triggered, but they have all the words.
They get aggressive.
Exactly. They get aggressive. right? But what happens is the more that the pursuer gets aggressive, the more the withdrawer wants to pull back.
Right.
And the more the withdrawer wants to pull back, the more that the pursuer wants to double down on the pursuit. Right? But the more that the pursuer is double downing on the pursuit, the more the withdrawer wants to pull back.
Okay.
Right? So here we are in this kind of what we describe as a negative interaction cycle. Right? And so what we try to help couples tap into is, what is the cycle that we get into? What are our triggers? What are our threat response behaviors? And what is essentially like the underlying pain story that we're not talking about? What are we not talking about that's sort of like under what we describe as the line of awareness? If all I see with my partner and I is our threat response behaviors, that often just leads to further disconnection. What we try to help couples tap into is something that's more vulnerable.
So, all right. So I get one's the aggressor, one's sort of more withdrawn. Okay. What I see is just like they're bored, like the excitement's gone. I think sometimes people make the mistake that getting married is the end goal, whereas that's just the beginning. Now the work starts. So, what do you say to somebody who's been in it 10 years, 15 years, and they're like, the excitement's gone?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I always say, like, you can have safety without connection, but you can't have connection without safety. So what I mean by that is, like, I can go into, like, I don't know, the grocery store, and I can feel safe with the cashier, right? But that doesn't mean that I have connection with the cashier, right? So I can have safety without connection, but there's no way that I can have connection with someone without safety. So I think what you're putting language to is, okay, when a couple feels pretty safe, they feel safe with one another, but they're lacking that kind of intimacy, that kind of connection.
Right.
I think in those cases, you have to have the conversations. So many couples essentially fall flat because they are not having the conversations. They're not having the conversations because they feel like, you know what, maybe that partner's not going to understand. Maybe it doesn't matter that much. They start to minimize their own needs. They start to just fall into their own routines. You have to have the conversations.
Right.
Right. And in having the conversations of particularly like what you're describing, as far as like maybe the excitement's gone, you have to really start to tap into, okay, we've gotten into a rut. We're just roommates now. We're so focused on our kids that we've forgotten about our own relationship. What do we need? What do we need? I will tell you, Matt, I don't see that as often in my practice. I see situations where people are, like I call it, on life support. Couples are on life support, meaning like the safety has gone. It's not just about like, oh, we just kind of lost the spark. It's like, no, something really bad has happened in our relationship where like we don't even feel safe in a room with one another. So that's in my work. Like we have to really like rebuild the safety in order to get to that place of connection. Again, you're tracking with me?
No, I'm totally tracking. I see for the loss of the spark versus you probably are treating a clientele that is their, that's their, I guess you could say. It's some sort of,
It's gotten so far, like it's gotten so bad.
right.
That like connection isn't even like on the table yet.
Right.
Right? Like we got to get back to baseline of safety in order to start tapping into connection, right? Start tapping into, you know what? Like, okay, this is actually a person I want to be around. Like in my work with clients, it's often like the couples that they don't even really want to be around each other, let alone like build intimacy. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see. Well, the people I've been around and stuff, it wasn't a safety issue. It was totally a connectivity thing. Or they just, the desire to create something together is dead. Sad. And they try, they talk, and it's like, man, I don't know. Like it was hard finding something to grab on to start building upon. Sometimes I think people get, like you said, the kids at first are sort of that makes things exciting, and they're working together and they love their children. Once that becomes the norm, then there's there's not so much a game to play together. And if there's not something to play together, then the game becomes at each other versus togetherness. I don't know. So, yeah.
That's a really good point, right? Like the only way they know how to interact is maybe like just when it's the two of them is not necessarily in a healthy way, right? And so you got to really tap into, no, what are in fact my needs? Right? What do I want companionship around?
Right.
Right. And sometimes you like, even just as a person individually, I kind of forget, like, what do I need?
Yeah.
Let alone, how do I communicate it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, let's say a couple's engaged. They say, Julie, how do we make sure we have a successful, happy marriage that's going to last for eternity?
Oh, geez.
It's a tough one, isn't it? Is there any words of wisdom you'd say, like, all right, guys, I would do this, I would do this, and I'd avoid this? Anything like that?
Yes. I mean, I think you have to have conversations.
Okay.
Communication,
right?
Communication is critical.
Yeah.
Right? Where, relationships start to fall flat is you stop talking to one another. You stop talking to one another about the things that are really important. You start to keep things to yourself, or you talk about it with other people, competing attachments. You start to kind of like, even just like, almost like subconsciously sometimes, like withdraw a little bit.
Yeah.
So you have to have conversations. And when I think about like premarital, there is like a particular assessment tool that I often use. It's called Prepare and Enrich, where we actually go through very specific topics that couples may not have otherwise talked about organically. So for example, we'll talk about like finances. How do you want to move through your finances? Do you want to have joint accounts? Do you want to have separate accounts? Do you want to have both? Like, what does financial health look like for the two of you? We talk about family, right? Like extended family, family of origin. I almost always, when I work with individuals, couples, families, I spend at least a session or 2 sessions focused on your family of origin. Right? Because I always say these 2 things. We cannot heal what we do not acknowledge. Right? Which means you have to look at like, what is my family history? Right? The things that I have essentially like brought forward with me into my adult relationship subconsciously, well, almost always subconsciously. What we're trying to do is help you move into that adult relationship consciously, right? Like with awareness. There's another beautiful quote that says, pain travels through families until someone is ready to feel it. What I mean by that is, and that's not my quote, but what I received from that quote is that like generationally, people can experience trauma that is passed down until someone is ready to stop and feel it and say, wow, what has in fact been part of my generational history that has been problematic as a pattern, right? Whether it be as a pattern of thinking or a pattern of behaving. Right. So the family of origin work, I think, is critical for both people. And it's generally most effectively done through a third party, right? Like through a therapist who's equipped in helping people talk through some of those things, right? So finances, family history, like sexual intimacy, critical. Very difficult sometimes for people to talk about as far as their expectations, the things that they want, what has blocked them as far as really coming into their own sort of like full sexuality. The household, expectations, right? What is your expectation of yourself in a partnership? What is your expectation of your partner in a partnership, right? And engaging those conversations. What about parenting, right? So these are often conversations that may not necessarily come up organically, which I think does a couple that's moving into marriage a disservice. So go
ahead, sorry.
No, I think I was just going to say, like, as a therapist, I think it's really important for us to kind of move through these conversations topically.
Yeah.
As a way to really help couples like feel prepared to enter into marriage.
I think that's a great point. I think you could write a little document that has and let each fiance, whatever, fill out all that information and start comparing it. I know I was going to start a business partnership one time, and a friend of mine stepped in and was like, all right, Matt, who's going to do this? Have you divided the duties of the company? You're going to have to jointly decide on everything, or is somebody could be in charge of hiring and somebody in charge of treasury and somebody in charge of marketing. But you had to meet together so you didn't have a fight every time y'all kind of make a decision. And he was very wise advice. And I think, just like you're saying, with the marriage, you got to do the same thing.
Exactly. Because it's like, right, it's this like, where we find the most dissatisfaction is when our expectation and the reality becomes that far apart.
Yep.
Right? We bridge that gap of dissatisfaction the more that our expectations and the reality align.
Yeah. And goals, what are your goals in life? Because I think if somebody wants to help starving children in Africa and another wants to become rich and live in a mansion, like, don't start like, not easy to start that. Like, okay.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. Exactly. And why I say that like a facilitator or, a therapist could really help facilitate the conversation effectively is because, it can become something that if not engaged in a healthy way, almost like judgment.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? Or it starts to become a conversation that's more critical than actually like effective, right? Because what we want to really try to do is like co-create.
Right.
That's the language I often use.
That's a good word. I think
co-create.
If they could do that, they're on the right track.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes, exactly.
And like I said, at first, that's buying a house or raising the kids or whatever. It's easy to co-create with those, but after that becomes sort of common. Like, what can you co-create together?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Good. Well, can you give me an example? All right, so earlier we were talking about trauma. Somebody who experienced something is holding them back. It's interfering with their ability to have dreams or think big. Do you give us any examples from your past where, you took somebody in, they had experienced X, and you talked to them or you worked with them, and after that they had achieved another level of behavior?
Yeah, I mean, trauma is such a tough one. Let me start with just the definition of trauma that I particularly find to be most, I think, poignant and all-encompassing, because there are a lot of different definitions of trauma out there. I'd say trauma is anything that happened to us that was too much too fast, too much too long, or not enough too long, where we did not receive adequate support and resourcing. Okay, so anything that happened to us that was too much too fast, too much too long, or not enough too long.
Gotcha.
Okay, so that can
be physical or mental, like short divorce or, loss of a loved one or an accident, like a physical.
Absolutely, right? Like often like a singular event is like the too much too fast. Then something prolonged, like let's say you've experienced bullying, like for even like in your childhood, right? For a prolonged period of time. That's too much too long, or not enough too long could look like maybe like neglect in your childhood. You tracking with me?
Sure.
Right? So the too much too fast, too much too long, or not enough too long. So, I think as far as trauma, like I've had several clients who I've worked with who have experienced sexual trauma, whether it's rape, some kind of sexual assault that has really impacted their own sense of their value, how they see themselves and how they see the world around them. Right. So, and that I think is like the most critical, like those are the two most critical components as far as our healing is like, I would say, healing any of those distortions in those stories as far as like how I see myself. And I would say that is the number one, and how I see the world around.
Right.
Right. So maybe someone who's experienced rape, sexual trauma is, see themselves maybe as like damaged, broken, devalued, not worthy of love. Maybe they second guess themselves as far as who they are as intuitively. Maybe it has impacted how they see the world around them as far as like the world is unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
People are not safe.
Right.
I cannot have a relationship that is healthy. And so we really have to work through that, right? We have to really work through the experience of like what is in fact that's the story that they're telling themselves about themselves. We have to look at it. We have to put it into the light. Again, we cannot heal what we do not acknowledge. So we first have to look at it, and then we have to interrogate its accuracy and its efficacy. Right? What I mean by that is just because you have had an incredibly negative, awful experience with someone, it does not mean that you are not worthy of love. It does not mean that your intuition is off.
How do you get them to realize that?
You got to sit with it.
Sit with it. I don't understand.
Sit with it as in you got to just like hold space for them. Like you got to just be in that space with them. Like you got to let them move through their own emotional experience to kind of
talk about it, going over it, that sort of a thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, gotcha.
Until they can tap into their own intuitive wisdom, until they can in fact recognize, no, there are a lot of other places in my life where my intuition has been accurate. There are a lot of other places in my life in which, my like I am engaged a healthy relationship. Or maybe there's only one other place in my life where I've engaged a healthy relationship. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with ACEs. ACEs is Adverse Childhood Experiences, which is like, it's a kind of an assessment tool now that people use as far as like tracking for trauma, like therapists use for tracking for trauma. And what the ACEs score tells us is a beautiful predictor of like resilience for children who have experienced like significant trauma, meaning they have like a high ACEs score, like which means like compounded traumas. So a predictor for them of resilience, or like maybe the possibility of going on to lead like a healthy life that is, relationally connected, is two things. One is high IQ, and the other is just one person who's believed in. Just having one person who's believed in them.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. So as far as sitting with people who've experienced some kind of trauma, right, the intention is even if it's just me, even if it's just therapist who communicates to the person who's experienced this trauma that we believe in this.
Yeah, that's good. I agree. Just having someone to communicate with and someone who will listen. It's nice. Really listen.
Yes.
And get it.
Yes, exactly.
It's certainly very therapeutic.
Yes, exactly. And, I think to some extent we have to also practice what we described as like exposure therapy, right? Like, if you decide, I'm not going to go on and let's say a date with somebody that I don't know, like I'm not going to go on a blind date. Like that feels like way too much for what I've been through. Okay. So let's look at what maybe feels like a 0 to 20. Let's not go 0 to 100. Let's not even go 0 to 60. What's like a 0 to 20 for you? Maybe it's like you going with a friend to a party, right? Where you don't know everybody there, but you give yourself permission to engage with some guardrails. You track, like, so that's what we try to help people do also through the modality of exposure therapy, is like take them from 0 to 20. Okay, I felt successful 0 to 20. So now how can we just kind of continue to move forward to essentially get you to where you want to be?
Gotcha. Good. And you've seen people recover? Like some of these people who've had the horrible experiences, are they able to now date and live life?
Listen, Nat, I would not be in this job for 15 years if that were not the case. Okay. I would have gotten out a long time ago if I didn't see the efficacy of this work. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah, you started off earlier with an example. And kind of going, when I asked you for an example, you started mentioning somebody who's been sexually abused or assaulted and stuff like that. Yeah. I guess I was looking to close it out with, and now they're blah. I don't doubt you.
I know. Yes, absolutely. The answer to that is yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, good deal. All right, cool. Yeah, going back to communication, one of the things I think that I've seen, this is with couples, and I'm not a therapist. I'm not trying to act like I am. But I've helped people, but I'm not like you, not on your level. But the communication, sometimes people communicate, they don't actually communicate. Somebody says something, but the other is just disagreeing with it. And that's not actually communication. They're not actually exchanging and receiving information. Kind of just one way, is instead of actually, okay, I understand what you're saying. Like,
Totally. Yeah. God, that is so hard. Yeah.
It's like, okay,
yeah, it's a really hard thing. And that's, like, I think even just the practice of active listening. And there are tools to that, right? Like,
sure.
Like, let me make sure I got that right. What I hear you saying is this. Did I get that right?
Yeah. And not judge it. Just listen. Not like think, that's ridiculous. Or that's no way. I've done just the opposite. Like, no, just listen. That's hard for people.
Oh my gosh. It can feel nearly impossible sometimes.
That's right. Yeah.
But what we know is that not doing that is essentially it's entirely ineffective. So I always try to take away like the value judgment, like it's either good or bad. Like I take that out and I just look at like, what is it going to be effective for you? What's going to be effective for you? We can do this all day long, right. But what's that gonna, where's that going to lead you? Yeah. Right.
That's right. Yeah. Well, cool. All right. Well, Ms. Hall, listen, it has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for all the work that you do with people. Because that certainly is a very needed service. And I know a lot of people in those situations don't feel they have any options. They're kind of like stuck, or they feel that's just life. So it's good to hear of potential solutions out there that are helping people survive. I always say, Matt, if people ask me, like, are there couples that you see that you're like, there is no hope? And I would say, like I put it in like the 90%. Like, I see hope for every couple who comes into the office. Because if you're 90%. Yeah, if you come into the office, it means that there is something here that we can work with. Do you find one of the things I always start with when I'm just talking to whoever, I'm like, what do you want? Like, what's your goal? Do you find that they're like, we want to save our marriage, or they're like, no, I'm done? Or they might not even know at that point. They got to kind of put up some layers before they can decide. I think some couples, they don't know. Some couples are entirely misaligned. Yeah. Right? Meaning like one person like really wants it and the other person's like ambivalent. Right. And what we try to do in the couple space is we really try to re-engage the person who's ambivalent. We call that withdrawal re-engagement. Okay. Right? So that is our primary, like, first and foremost intention, is to help re-engage the person who is more shut down. Then we can really do the connection work. Cool. Good. Very good. All right. Well, again, very needed work, and certainly in the area of relationships. That's an area of life that needs some help. They've got some pretty negative statistics in it. I know. Yeah. All right. Well, listen, thanks again, Julie. It has been a pleasure talking with you and getting to meet you. Thank you, Matt. All right. Take care. Take care. Yeah, you have a good day. All right. Yep. Thank you, everybody else, for joining us. It's been another Hines on Air. If you haven't already, comment below, share this, and follow us on YouTube. And we look forward to seeing you on the next Hines on Air.